Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. I want to be respectful of your time. So thank you for joining us today. We will be presenting on moral illusions, the self-serving bias, and moral myopia. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Please mute your microphone and use the raise your hand feature provided by Teams, and you'll be recognized to speak. We'll be pausing throughout the presentation for discussion. I would like to start out by introducing you to the field of behavioral ethics. Behavioral ethics is a field of social science that studies and attempts to give us an understanding of how people actually behave when faced with ethical dilemmas. Research in behavioral ethics finds that people are far from completely rational. Most ethical choices are made intuitively, by feeling, not after carefully analyzing a situation. Usually, people who make unethical decisions are unconsciously influenced by internal biases, like the self-serving bias, by outside pressures like the pressure to conform, and by situational factors that they do not even notice. Behavioral ethics seeks to understand why ordinary, good people do bad things, often without being fully aware that they are acting against their own values. Moral illusions are spontaneous, intuitive, moral judgments. Moral illusions mainly arise in competitive situations when people compete for the same rewards. This is a consequence of psychological mechanisms that cause us to assess fairness differently depending on whether we are successful or not. This is particularly the case when we lack information about the fairness of the situation. When the brain attempts to fill in missing information, it may create an image that does not match reality, in the same way as occurs for an optical illusion. One example is how we view losing. If we lose, we tend to blame it on other factors, such as the playing field was not level or that the game was rigged. When we win, in contrast, we tend to explain this by our excellent playing skills. During the long course of human evolution, the 5 physical senses, especially sight, hearing, and touch, have been critical for survival. It makes sense then that these physical senses are probably better calibrated than our moral sense. Evolutionary biologist Steven Pinker writes, "It seems we may all be vulnerable to moral illusions, the ethical equivalent of the bending lines that trick the eye on cereal boxes and in psychology textbooks. Behavioral ethics is a new field that uses illusions to unmask a sixth sense, the moral sense." So I have a short clip that I'd like to play for you on moral illusions.
You know the 5 physical senses: sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. But did you know we also have a moral sense? It's what helps guide our moral judgments and actions. You know that pit that opens up in your stomach when you're about to do something wrong? That's your moral sense kicking in. But beware, the brain can be fooled. Ever seen an optical illusion? Take a look at this. What do you see? Not everything is as it seems. Even sound can trick your brain. Watch this.
Ba, ba, ba.
What do you hear?
Ba, ba, ba.
What about now?
Ba, 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 ba.
The only sound that ever bounced off your eardrums was ba, ba, ba. But the brain prioritizes what we see over what we hear, so you probably heard fa, fa, fa the second time.
Ba, ba, ba.
This illusion is known as the McGurk effect.
Ba.
Pretty wild, huh? Just as our brain can be tricked by optical and auditory illusions, our moral sense can also be fooled. For example, because our brain has evolved to help us survive, we tend to process information in ways that serve our self-interest. Often, What is best for us seems to us to be what is best. But this is a moral illusion. It's called the self-serving bias. There are many ways moral illusions can lead even the most well-meaning people astray. All the psychological biases, mental shortcuts, social pressures, and other factors such as time pressure and stress that are described by behavioral ethics research create moral illusions. Learning about behavioral ethics can help you uncover these illusions, and it can also help you learn how to guard against them.
So I wanted to start off by showing you a quick popular optical illusion known as the impossible trident. So note how at the bottom of the figure, there appear to be 3 prongs to the fork, but at the top, there appear to be only 2. You will see something which appears physically possible, yet which you know is not. Our brain analyzes the shape of the trident and tries to count pillars. We see 2 pillars at the top and 3 at the bottom and understand that this object is impossible. That brings us to our next topic, the self-serving bias. The self-serving bias is a type of cognitive bias that involves taking personal credit for successes while blaming others for negative outcomes on external factors. People often unconsciously make decisions that serve themselves in ways that other people might view as indefensible or unethical. The self-serving bias, which affects everyone, distorts how people gather, process, and even remember information in ways that serve their self-interest and their established beliefs. This often leads well-intentioned people to conclude that what is good for them is what is good for everyone. This, of course, is a moral illusion. Studies show that we can easily see how the self-serving bias affects others' actions, but we have difficulty realizing how it affects our own. This cartoon is a great example. So sales have been consistently down 35% all of last year. Well, it was due to my schedule. Bad hours. You write your own schedule, Lark. It was because of the receiving crew. They were really unproductive. Another self-serving bias example is doctors tend to believe that they are immune from the influence of gifts they receive from pharmaceutical companies. But studies show those gifts have a significant effect on what medications doctors prescribe. One study found that 64% of doctors believe that the freebies they receive from pharmaceutical companies influenced other doctors. However, only 16% of doctors thought it affected their own actions. So the self-serving bias often blinds us to the ways in which we are prejudiced in favor of ourselves. Indeed, it can cause even the most well-intentioned of us to completely overlook our own bad actions. And I have a short clip that I would like to play that illustrates this concept.
Psychological pressures, especially ones we're not conscious of, often make it difficult for us to be as good as we would like to be. One of the most significant is the self-serving bias. The tendency we have to gather information, process information, and even remember information in such a manner as to advance our self-interest and support our pre-existing views. Because of this bias, even when people try their hardest to be fair and impartial, their judgments are inevitably shaded by their own self-interest, often in ways that seem indefensible to others.
Give me a break.
As a journalism major, I've, written articles before, and I definitely, sometimes I feel very strongly about an issue that I'm writing about, and I look for sources that kind of reinforce my own opinion.
The pleasure centers in our brains light up when we are told that our beliefs are correct, or that a conclusion that advances our self-interest is accurate. Therefore, it's not surprising that people with conservative political beliefs are more likely to watch Fox News, while liberals are more likely to watch MSNBC. Not only does the self-serving bias affect the information that we seek out, it also affects how we process that information.
Yes. Yes.
Thus, supporters of competing political candidates who watch the same debate each tend to conclude that their guy won.
As a filmmaker, sometimes you have a cut of your movie that's not complete yet and you're seeking feedback from other people. If they give you feedback that doesn't go with that or is the opposite of what you're expecting them to say, it's easy to be like, oh, well, I asked the wrong people.
The self-serving bias even affects how we remember information.
Safe.
Studies show that we are more likely to recall evidence that supports our point of view than evidence that opposes it. Because of the self-serving bias, studies show that when scientists review articles, they will tend to conclude that those supporting their pre-existing point of view are of higher quality than those opposing their point of view.
I had an assignment just past semester that was a debate. I read our side of the argument, and so it's very easy to be like, this is great, like this is everything that I've been looking for, and then the failure to read the other side, I mean, can be a really big problem.
An accountant industry official testified before the SEC saying, "We are professionals that follow our code of ethics and practice by the highest moral standards. We would never be influenced by our own personal financial well-being." This testimony reflected an embarrassing ignorance of the impact of self-interest upon all humans' decision-making. Inevitably, our self-interest clouds our ethical judgment, even in the most well-intentioned people. The more subjective the judgment, the less certain the facts, and the more that's at stake, the more influential the self-serving bias is likely to be. Don't make the same mistake. Guard against the self-serving bias.
If everyone's looking out for their own individual effect and what they're doing, they're not going to look out for collectively what they could do as a whole and what to move society forward.
It might be the difference between having a discussion with someone and having an argument with someone, and I think having an argument is about winning and proving that your opinion is correct.
And you just gotta be more objective and be open to other people's ideas and thoughts.
If you can understand their viewpoint, I think we'll all be in a better place, and you've started to diminish the effects of the self-serving bias.
So the last concept that I would like to talk about that ties into our case study is moral myopia. So moral myopia refers to the inability to see ethical issues clearly. The term coined by Minette Drumright and Patrick Murphy describes what happens when we do not recognize the moral implications of a problem or we have a distorted moral vision. An extreme version of moral myopia is called moral blindness. So moral myopia occurs at 3 levels. The first is at the individual level. So people may become so focused on other aspects of a situation, like pleasing their professor or boss or meeting sales targets, that ethical issues are obscured. The second occurs at the organizational level. So organizations can experience moral myopia too, as Major League Baseball did during the steroid era. For more than a decade, players got bigger, hit more home runs, and revenues rose dramatically. But the league didn't see it, even as evidence of steroid use was rampant. And the third is at the societal level. Societies may also suffer moral myopia, as they often have done at the expense of minorities. For instance, the treatment of Native Americans and the enslavement of African Americans are 2 examples of moral blindness in the history of the United States. So I have a video for you on moral myopia.
There are many people with good intentions out there. People who have pledged to abide by honor codes in college and ethics codes in the workplace, who make bad decisions and get caught up in ethical problems and even scandals. My co-author, Patrick Murphy, and I have found in our research that some people have moral lapses because of what we have called moral myopia. Moral myopia is a distortion of moral vision that keeps ethical issues from coming clearly into focus. In fact, moral myopia can be so severe that an individual is blind to ethical lapses and doesn't see them at all.
If everyone's doing it, I can't be wrong. Everyone's doing it, it's fine.
Moral myopia can take many forms, but it generally occurs at one of three levels: the individual, the organization, or society. A person with moral myopia may not see a problem with something like fudging the numbers on a timesheet or an expense report, or with lying to a supervisor or a client in order to look a little better. At the organizational level, an advertising executive might say, "I could just never advertise cigarettes." But if her agency simultaneously has a tobacco account as a client, and she doesn't even see an ethical problem, then she has a form of moral myopia.
I think the issue that we're blind to here at the university is diversity in housing here.
It is kind of strange that, this campus is all about like diversity and stuff, yet the most populated area where most students live is just one type of not diverse at all whatsoever.
We found that moral myopia tends to occur most often at the societal level. Think about an advertising executive. Assume that she knows that ultra-thin models and ads can have a negative impact on young women's perceptions of beauty and contribute to problems such as eating disorders. But she doesn't see any connection between the models that she selects for the ads and this societal problem.
I just remember this one particular article that I read was talking about Victoria Beckham and her clothing line, before she puts it out to the public, she has it fitted on her body so that the normal woman can, to make sure that it's not just stick-thin models who can wear her clothes, it's the normal woman. If you've ever seen Victoria Beckham, she's maybe 5'2" and weighs, 75 pounds. She's not by any means the normal woman. In general, as a society, as women as a whole, we have a very distorted view of what is healthy and what is normal.
How can smart people miss these things that should be so apparent? The culprit seems to be rationalizations. Some of the most common rationalizations that underpin moral myopia are rationalizations such as, if it's legal, it must be moral, or if it's not illegal, it must be ethical. Listen to what the CEO of a major company said to me. "I think this is probably one of the most ethical businesses there is. It's so regulated. Everything that we do has to go through our lawyers to make sure it's conforming to the law, and then our clients' lawyers. It's really hard to be unethical in this business, even if you wanted to." He's making a classic mistake. Most all ethicists and legal scholars view the law as the minimum, yet we get comfort from the law. Guess what this CEO's industry is? Advertising. In poll after poll on industry ethics, advertising comes in second to last. The only industry less trusted than advertising is used car sales.
I think one of the ones that's biggest in my mind is healthcare. Is that for a lot of people who get to make the decisions about whether to give their employees health care, whether they view it as a state issue to give health care or a national issue to give health care, they have health care. They've never been in a situation, most of them have never been in a situation for any long or serious amount of time where they haven't been able to go to a doctor.
What occurs in companies, and in other types of organizations as well, is that someone gets so caught up in the enthusiasm of her organization and its efforts to reach certain goals that she doesn't see signs that should be red flags. And then there's the ostrich syndrome. just sticking your head in the sand and ignoring ethical issues. And we all know that that's never a solution.
So last semester in my economics class, we had homework quizzes that were assigned every week, and we would answer questions on Blackboard online. In the beginning, all the students kind of just did the homework questions on their own, but starting towards the middle of the semester, we all kind of realized that we could compare our answers before we turned them in. We, at first, weren't really sure if it was right, but we kind of just didn't want to think about the fact that it could be wrong.
It's important to be aware of moral myopia and the rationalizations that support it, so that the rationalizations will raise red flags and prompt a careful examination. It can be helpful to have trusted advisors outside of our work unit, company, industry, or profession, because sometimes an entire group of people can suffer from moral myopia.
We don't believe it's us that's the problem. We see everyone else doing it and say, oh, it's them, it's not us, we're fine.
I think a lot of it is kind of is actually stepping into the other person's shoes, as opposed to just grandstanding and saying, yes, I know the plights of the poor. Actually meeting someone and talking to someone who's living in those conditions.
There needs to be a more healthy discussion of ethics and what is really right. What frameworks are we using to evaluate certain issues?
It comes down to us and our responsibility as a society, as individuals, to take care of problems.
So studies on selective attention prove that people generally see what they expect to see. And if you joined us last time, this was illustrated in the invisible gorilla experiment. So if you focus too much on pleasing your boss or getting along with coworkers, you may not see an ethical issue which is right in front of you. It is our responsibility as people who wish to live ethical lives to keep ethics in our frame of reference. We can do so by reminding ourselves every morning that we wish to be good and that to meet that goal, we must constantly strive to act ethically. Looking out for ethical minefields is part of our personal and professional responsibility every day. Behavioral ethics teaches that we must practice listening to our moral intuition, to our gut, rather than turning all ethical discussions into legalistic exercises like lawyers weighing both sides of the issue or accountants parsing technical language in an attempt to justify a position that intuition tells them is wrong. Our gut instinct is not always right, but we would be foolish not to ignore it. Psychologists Destino and Valdesolo say this: when faced with a moral decision, take a few seconds to pause and listen to the inner voices. Is there a hint of guilt, a hint of shame, a gut feeling of unease? If so, don't ignore it. This is your moral awareness awakening. So are there any questions before I turn it over to Dawn? Okay, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dawn.
So you received a case study with the training invitation on cheating Atlanta school scandal. I'll give you a brief overview of that case study and then we'll discuss it. This case study illustrates moral myopia in the actions of teachers and administrators who adjusted struggling students' test scores in an effort to save their school from closure. Atlanta School Superintendent Beverly Hall believed that business approaches and the values of the market system could save public education. She set accountability measures for the Atlanta School District and created performance objectives that were tougher than those of the No Child Left Behind Act, the federal program that became law in 2002. Teacher evaluations were linked to students' performance on standardized tests. Schools whose students did not make appropriate progress towards the standardized test goals received escalating sanctions that ultimately accumulated in replacement of the faculty and staff and restructuring or closing of the school. Parks Middle School was in dire straits because it had been classified as a school in need of improvement for the previous 5 years. Unless 58% of students passed the math portion of the standardized test, and 67% passed the language arts portion, Parks Middle School could be closed. Its students would be separated and bused across town to different schools and its teachers dismissed. Christopher Waller, the new principal of Parks, had heard that teachers in the elementary school that fed into Parks had changed their student answers on the standardized test under the guise of erasing stray pencil marks. Waller asked Damian Lewis and other teachers to do the same. Lewis found the exams of students who needed to get a few more questions correct in order to pass. The teachers then changed their wrong answers to the right ones. If he did not change their scores, Lewis feared that his students would lapse into why try attitudes. They would lose their neighborhood school and the community that had developed within it. Parks met the standards set by Beverly Hall for the first time that year. Beverly Hall was praised for turning around the Atlanta school system and received a $78,000 bonus and was recognized as National Superintendent of the Year in 2009. In 2010, the state of Georgia identified an unusually high number of wrong to right corrections on their standardized test. Georgia Governor Sonny Perdue asked the FBI to investigate the standardized test also. The FBI uncovered a cheating scandal that involved Parks and 43 other schools. By July 2012, the FBI had identified 110 educators that had changed answers on tests. 34 of those educators were indicted. All but 12 took plea deals. 12 educators were tried and 11 were convicted. Beverly Hall was influenced by the self-serving bias, but the teachers in this cheating scandal cooperated not only for the rewards, but also due to facing the prospect of losing their jobs if they did not help. Psychological studies show that people are loss averse, meaning in part that teachers will cheat to avoid losing their jobs in ways that they would never do to get the jobs in the first place. In addition, teachers are motivated to please their superiors, like the superintendent, in part because of their own self-interest is at stake, but also because we are generally programmed to please authority figures. So now we have a few questions for you. Like we said before, if you'll raise your hand as we ask these questions if you want to answer. So the first question is, what were the benefits to changing test scores and what were the harms? Go ahead, Monique.
I think that the benefits to changing the test scores were to try to save the school, because the school was facing such sanctions based upon the superintendent's enhancement of the standards beyond the No Child Left Behind standards. But the harms were that, number one, because the teachers changed the answers for the students, and the students had walked away with a false sense of accomplishment. Because if the reason that the standards are put in place is to measure the effectiveness, the efficacy of the teaching within the schools. And so if the answers were changed for the students, and although the students experienced that short-term euphoria of saying, oh, we made it and we did well, then it was a false sense of accomplishment for the students. So there were far-reaching harms, because the students not only had that temporary false sense of accomplishment, but then they were going to be moved on to other grades, and they hadn't mastered the competencies for the grade from which they were tested. And so although the teachers thought that they were saving their jobs because they had they were trying to save their own necks, okay, that moral myopia, that on the individual level, what happened is that there were no benefits that were accrued by the students for whom the scores were changed.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good answer, because actually the state of Georgia, after they identified this cheating scandal, They implemented a program. They identified the students that were affected by this, and they gave them extra help and tried to help them because they had students with learning disabilities that their test scores were changed so that they didn't identify that they were having issues and they didn't receive that help. I think that program actually ended last year. I think that's when the last of the students that were affected by this cheating scandal actually graduated. So we'll go to our next question. How did the stakes in this case influence the teacher's decisions?
Well, it all boiled down to a matter of money, as these times, and as a matter of fact, all times seem to be directly correlated to. And whereas the money for employment and the economy there in that particular community was grossly affected by these type of decisions, they maintained the solidarity of the community in spite of great odds. And this all could have been changed with a little bit of attention to the laws, regulations, policies, procedures, and protocols. And it would have saved some time. But in retrospect, we don't get the opportunity for hindsight. But here again, if you tie together the mores and folkways of a particular community and also influence those into your policy and procedures, then you can kill two birds with one stone. And often, in my opinion, we've missed the track in this regard, but we're trying to catch up. So there's good news. The end of the tunnel is within sight. Thank you.
All right. And our final question is, what prompted Lewis's moral myopia? Go ahead, Monique.
In my opinion, Lewis's moral myopia stemmed forth from the fact that that the school would be closed because he focused primarily on the fact that if the school didn't achieve their goal regarding the standardized test scores, that the faculty and staff would be replaced and they would close the school. The students would be bused to other schools across the city, and some other issues that were that would stem forth from the school not achieving their goal. And so basically, when in our previous examples discussing moral myopia and how it referred to the inability to see ethical issues clearly on an individual, organizational, as well as a societal level, I think that Lewis, all those factors combined prompted his moral myopia, because he didn't want the students to be bused to other schools. He didn't want the school to close. He didn't want the faculty and staff to lose their jobs. And so I think that all of the three levels of moral myopia, the individual, the organizational, as well as the societal levels combined, all prompted Lewis's moral myopia in this case.
Yeah, and I agree with that answer. I actually did some further reading on this topic. Go ahead, Eden.
No, I was just going to kind of go off of what Monique said and just say, yeah, it did mention that, you know, he also was kind of rationalizing things because of that, what, you know, they were trying to study and do really well, but even if they were to fail, he didn't want them to, you know, kind of suffer or lapse into that why try attitude. So I think that definitely was a part of maybe, like, you know, instead of this selfish scenario of wanting to lose jobs and things of that, maybe he was rationalizing it with, well, let's try to help these students like boost their confidence, I guess, on like a positive note. So that's just kind of one of the things I felt like he was trying to accomplish as well.
Yeah, and I've read some of the interviews that Lewis did after this was exposed, and he actually speaks about the fact that he was so focused on his students, he didn't consider the consequences for himself. He actually wasn't indicted, but he lost his job. It actually ended his marriage. He was married to another teacher who wasn't implicated in this cheating scandal. And he said that his marriage just never recovered once she found out. She just never looked at him the same way again. And he hasn't ever been able to find another teaching job. And he said most jobs, once they find out who he is, they just don't want to deal with him anymore. All right, so we'll move on to our next slide. These are questions, these let's hear from you slide is kind of questions kind of about your own experience. So the first one is, would you agree that if you have your ethical antenna up, that you would be more likely to detect an ethical issue you face than if you are focusing completely on pleasing your boss, being part of your team, or perhaps more a production quota, or perhaps meeting a production quota? Go ahead, Ashley.
Yeah, I mean, I can see even myself doing this sometimes where like I start to you know, question myself more. And if I see it in somebody else, like I see somebody else like justifying their actions, and it's from the outside, like it's so obvious what they're doing, right? So a lot of times that's something that sparks it in me, seeing it in other people. I'm like, okay, well, maybe I need to look at my actions a little bit more. So. But I feel like I could use this training or, topics more often. Just it's just like an awareness, right? Like to stay cognizant of how we're acting.
And I think that's the big takeaway we want everyone to leave with today, is to just kind of be more ethically aware of kind of how what you're doing and how your actions affect others. All right. So our next question is, think about the last time that your gut told you not to do something. Was it right or wrong?
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that, because when you fly by the seat of your pants, like I've had to over the years, you have to make some pretty clear and determined answers to the questions and the issues that you bring up. So there again, as long as you've got the members of your team or office or staff or whatever working together on whatever your focus or your goal is, then it's always been a great benefit. But the problem that more or less we're facing these days here in Cherokee specifically is, mixed messages. So this is another thing that needs to be attended to, and you can stop it pretty quick by education and knowledge and understanding of what's happened in the past. And that's why, again, there's so many people around that have worked effectively with programming and programs and grants and contracts and funding and such, that we're not even benefiting from their wisdom, guidance, and direction. And maybe we can have more of that in future, because it's my opinion personally and professionally that this could only be a wise investment for the tribe to amplify on the ethical issues that most of us who are still doing some clinical work, consultation and such, need to be aware of, because these days, if you don't catch up with everything that's going on in your particular area of focus, then you've missed half of the boat. But that's all I'm going to say. But let's all take advantage of these benefits and utilize them. You'd be surprised at the resources that are available, that all you need to do is ask. Thank you for that opportunity to say that.
So I know just in our office, Tashina and myself, a lot of times we'll talk about, whenever a decision is made, our gut instinct and what's right and wrong, and we bounce it off each other to determine the best course of action. So we'll actually move on. Our next slide, this will be our takeaway slides. So our takeaways for moral illusions. Just as the brain can be fooled, as illustrated in the McGurk effect, the moral sense can also be fooled. We tend to process information in ways that serve our self-interest. Mental shortcuts, social pressures, psychological biases, and other factors all contribute to moral illusions. Learning about behavioral ethics can help you to uncover moral illusions and help you learn how to guard against them. So the self-serving bias takeaways. The self-serving bias leads people to believe what is good for them is what is good for everyone. It can distort the way information is gathered, processed, and even remembered so that it serves the individual's self-interest. The self-serving bias can be overcome by always keeping ethics in our frame of reference, building self-awareness, being open to criticism, and finding ways to give others credit. And then the moral myopia takeaways. Every day, those who desire to act ethically must remind themselves of their ethical aspirations and of the need to constantly keep their ethical antenna extended, looking out for ethical minefields. When faced with a moral decision, take a few seconds to pause and listen to your inner voices. Is there a hint of guilt, a hint of shame, a gut feeling of unease? If so, don't ignore it. This is your moral awakening. It is important to be aware of moral myopia and the rationalizations that support it, so that the rationalizations will raise red flags and prompt a careful examination. Don't subject yourself to ostrich syndrome by putting your head in the sand and ignoring issues. It can be helpful to have trusted advisors outside of your work unit, company, industry, or profession to seek advice from, because sometimes an entire group of people can suffer from moral myopia. So that's the end of our presentation today. Does anyone have any questions or any comments you would like to make? Go ahead, Monique.
I'd just like to say, Dawn, this was great. Tashina, this was great. I really enjoyed this. I had heard, well, I'd read about the Atlanta schools cheating scandal, but I had never even thought enough to compare that with ethical illusions and aligning that with the issues that you guys have brought out today in discussing moral issues and moral illusions as you've done this Ethics Unwraps piece. So I really thought this was very nice. Thank you.
Go ahead, Eden.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you guys as well. You guys always do a really good job in these trainings that you guys provide to the tribe. So I just wanted to say good job and thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
I'd just like to say, Don, that I certainly appreciate the opportunity to join in. I have been experiencing some difficulties, but it just goes to show you, if you've got determination, that you can finally connect. So that's a lesson for all of us, I reckon, is just to keep at it. And with the support and the information available to all of us, Anytime anybody wants to holler at me, everybody knows how to get a hold of me. So let me know, because as I said before, I'm here to help you guys. And if there's any ethical or any kind of issues that you want to discuss, feel free to give me a holler. You all know how to do that. If you don't, just ask somebody. Thanks again, Don. I appreciate this opportunity. And as everybody has mentioned, it really was enlightening. Thanks.
So we'll go ahead and close out this session, but we just want to let you know also that this training, once we conclude today, this recording will actually be made available on the website for the Office of Internal Audit and Ethics. It should be up in the next week or two. So if you want to come back and revisit your training or show it to your coworkers, it should be available. Oh, and the previous quarterly trainings are also available on there. So if you missed any of those, you can go back and view those also. All right. Well,
Awesome.
thank you
Thank
all
you,
for
guys.
attending. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. We appreciate your attendance.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.